It started with confetti, not the fun kind that you throw in the air to celebrate. It was the dry, static Klein kind that sticks to your polyester shirt and hides in the seams of your clothes for 3 annoying days after the cleanup is done. Donald Vance, the 56-year-old operations manager, stood on a stepladder, hot gluing the final centerpiece for the anniversary party of Aegis Tech Group. It was their 18th year in business, or 19th if you counted the months the original founder spent running things out of a damp garage behind a lawnmower repair shop. Donald was double-checking the catering invoices, ensuring the vegan and gluten-free options were all accounted for when he noticed a glaring omission. His own name was completely missing from the digital invitation for the all-hands celebration dinner. At first, he tried to tell himself it was just a simple oversight. It was probably Julian Brady again. Julian was his 34-year-old boss, the newly appointed director of strategic operations. Julian was the type of man who wore loafers without socks, kept a standing desk that looked like a space station, and spoke exclusively in corporate buzzwords. He had a beard that looked like it was sponsored by a grooming subscription service, and the emotional depth of a wet cardboard box. Julian had once asked Donald what a physical fax machine did, then laughed arrogantly because he thought Donald was making up the explanation. He spent his days sipping protein drinks and complaining about office efficiency, completely unaware of the actual work required to keep the business running. Donald sighed, stepped down from the stepladder, and rubbed his aching lower back. He did not have the energy to argue over a digital invite. There were hundreds of shipping labels to print, balloon arches to arrange, and name badges to alphabetize. Secretly, Donald loved the order of it all. He loved the systems, the checklists, and the quiet control. This office, with all its broken coffee makers, its filing cabinet quirks, and its mandatory human resources workshops, was something he had built from the ground up. He knew which employees cheated on their hours and who was secretly dating someone in another department. He was the one who had copies of the server room keys made years ago when the administration was too disorganized to track them. He bought the emergency supplies, stocked the pantry, and made sure the engineers had their favorite snacks. Every minor detail of daily operations passed through his hands. So when his computer pinged at 47 minutes past 4 in the afternoon with a subject line that reads staffing updates, he did not expect his entire life to shift. He clicked the message. It was 2 sentences long, cold, and direct, with no greeting or pleasant closing. The email stated that effective immediately, his position as operations manager had been deemed redundant, and human resources would process his final payment. Redundant. The word felt like a physical blow. Not fired for a mistake, not retired with a handshake, just labeled redundant, like a piece of outdated machinery. His screen cast a dull reflection of his shocked face back at him. Outside his glass-fronted corner cubicle, the busy office kept moving. Julian was laughing loudly at some joke on his phone. A marketing assistant named Chloe Foster was posting on social media about the hustle lifestyle while barely working 2 hours a day, and the chat notifications continued to chime. Donald stood up slowly, his joints popping, and walked to the supply closet. He stared at the rows of label makers and spare items he had bought with his own money to help coworkers who never thought to plan ahead. He had spent 18 years organizing this company, and now he was being discarded. He slumped back into his chair, looking at his written list of tasks for the week. All of them were crossed off with clean red ink. His hand reached toward the bottom drawer, the deep one, where he kept old papers that nobody else knew existed. He had not opened those files in years. His mind was already a library of numbers and corporate history, but he needed physical proof. Tucked between an old company brochure and some early sketches of the corporate logo was a yellowed folder labeled Property Lease Signed Copy. Donald opened the page. His eyes fell on his own signature, his personal business name, and the legal description of the property. It was the original lease for the company primary data center. He had signed it 18 years ago as a personal favor to the original founder, Harvey Higgins, back when the startup had 0 credit and no bank would trust them. Donald had signed the lease using his own registered company, VTS Bookkeeping and Logistics LLC, because his personal credit was flawless. Harvey Higgins had hugged him back then and joked that Donald technically owned the lifeblood of the entire operation. Donald had laughed it off. He was not laughing now. He stared at Julian's email on the screen. The sting of betrayal turned into a cold, steady anger. He realized he was not just an old dinosaur. He was the foundation of the building, and Julian had just tried to sweep him away. He packed his few personal belongings into a cardboard box, shut down his computer, and walked out the door without saying a word to anyone. The office was busy with people planning the celebration, none of them realizing that the man who made it all possible was leaving for the last time. As he walked to his car, he felt a strange sense of clarity. The company had discarded him, but they had also forgotten the legal reality of their own business. Donald did not shed a single tear on the drive home. He did not yell at the steering wheel either. Instead, he felt a strange, quiet focus take over his mind. He drove his old sedan through the evening traffic, navigating the familiar streets while his brain worked through the legal files he had saved. The radio was playing a loud pop song, so he reached out and turned the knob until there was only static. Static felt more honest. He parked in his driveway, staring at the cracked concrete and the weeds growing through the gaps. The front porch light was shining, waiting for him. He had always left it on because he worked late nights at the office, but now it felt like a reminder of his wasted devotion. Inside, the house was silent except for the low hum of the kitchen refrigerator. Donald left his coat on a chair and sat at the kitchen table. He opened his personal laptop, which still had access to his external backup drive. He had copied all his personal archives before leaving, a habit of a man who never trusted digital clouds. He searched through a backup folder labeled Operations, Documents, and opened the file titled Data Center Lease Agreement. The document was filled with pages of dense legal language, server weights, electrical requirements, and temperature limits. He scrolled down until he found the specific section he needed. The lessor was VTS Bookkeeping and Logistics LLC. The lessee was Aegis Tech Group. The lease term was 19 years, beginning on March 2nd, 2007. Under the contract, the lease required manual monthly rent transfers from Aegis Tech Group to Donald's LLC, and any breach of the payment schedule would trigger an immediate 24-hour eviction protocol if the lease was not formally renewed. Donald blinked hard as he read the lines. His personal LLC, a business he had kept active just to help friends with taxes and handle small shipping contracts, was the sole legal owner of the concrete building housing every server, backup drive, and client database that Aegis Tech Group owned. It was a favor from 2007, back when the company was desperate and working out of a rented space with peeling floors and a single toilet. Harvey Higgins had come to him with a failed credit application and begged Donald to sign the lease under his LLC just to get the business started. They had promised to transfer the lease to the corporation once their credit improved, but they never did. Donald had never pushed the issue because they had treated him like family back then. Over the years, Donald had simply paid the annual registration fees and kept the LLC active, never thinking much about it. He closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen. The initial hurt was gone, replaced by a quiet, hot determination. He poured a glass of bourbon, drinking it neat with no ice. They had forgotten him. They had forgotten the scaffolding that kept their business off the ground. Julian, with his dismissive email and his pre-written human resources script, did not know he had just thrown a match onto a container of fuel. Donald smiled in the dark. It was a small, cold smile. The fire had been lit, and he was ready to watch it burn. He spent the rest of the night reviewing the lease terms line by line. The data center address was 4807 Richmond Parkway, Unit 3B. The contract stated that renewal was not automatic and required written notice 3 months before expiration, which had never occurred. Furthermore, the contract had an enforcement clause stating that any failure to pay the monthly lease amount within 10 days of the due date would render the lease void and allow the landlord to reclaim the property within 24 hours. Donald logged into his bank portal for VTS Bookkeeping and Logistics LLC. He scrolled through the monthly transactions and discovered that Aegis Tech Group had missed the rent payments for the last 5 months. Julian, in his effort to modernize the finance department and cut costs, had terminated the old manual transfer schedule without checking what the payments covered. He had assumed the building was owned by the corporation or handled under a different vendor. Donald realized they had missed 5 full payments. The contract was breached, the lease was expired, and the entire infrastructure was sitting on his property without a legal contract. Donald closed his bank page. He knew exactly what he had to do. He would not beg for his job back, nor would he ask for a severance package. He would simply reclaim his property and let them face the consequences of their arrogance. He drafted a timeline of events, noting the exact dates of the missed payments and the expiration of the lease. He knew that without the data center, their entire business would grind to a halt. Every client website, every database, and every internal tool was hosted on those physical servers. They had no idea they were building their digital empire on land they did not own. At 11 minutes past 3 in the morning, Donald picked up his phone and called his cousin, Gideon Vance. Gideon was a paralegal who spent his days dealing with stubborn developers and contract disputes. He had a deep cynicism about corporate management and a sharp mind for legal details. Gideon answered on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep. He asked if someone was hurt. Donald replied that no one was hurt, but some people were about to have a very bad day. Donald explained the entire situation: the termination email, the 19-year lease, his personal LLC, the 5 missed payments, and the 24-hour eviction clause. There was a long silence on the line as Gideon processed the information. Then, Gideon let out a loud laugh that echoed through the quiet house. He told Donald that this was the most incredible contract blunder he had ever seen, and that Aegis Tech Group was completely at his mercy. Gideon said that since they had no active lease and had failed to pay for 5 months, they were legally considered a tenant at sufferance under state property law. Under California Code of Civil Procedure, Section 1161, they were an unlawful detainer. They had no legal right to remain on the property, and Donald had the full authority to evict them immediately without waiting for a lengthy trial. Gideon explained that in commercial real estate, tenants do not enjoy the same tenant protections as residential renters. If a commercial tenant defaults on rent and the lease has expired, the landlord can execute an immediate repossession if the contract explicitly permits it. In this case, the original contract signed by Harvey Higgins contained a specific waiver that allowed the landlord to reclaim the building with a 24-hour warning if a payment default occurred. Gideon recommended they contact Sylvia Thorne, a commercial real estate attorney who was known for her aggressive courtroom presence. By 9 in the morning, Donald was sitting in Sylvia's office. He had not slept a single minute, but he felt completely alert, fueled by black coffee and a strong sense of purpose. Sylvia's office was quiet, filled with the scent of old paper and mahogany wood. She read the lease agreement and the bank records with meticulous attention. She looked up at Donald with a sharp smile, asking if he wanted a financial settlement or if he wanted to make them suffer. Donald replied that he wanted them out of his building. Sylvia spent 40 minutes drafting the eviction notice. The letter was a masterpiece of legal threat, citing the breach of lease terms, the 5 months of unpaid rent, and the lack of any written renewal. It declared that Aegis Tech Group was in unlawful possession of 4,807 Richmond Parkway, Unit 3B, and ordered them to vacate the property within 24 hours. The document cited specific case law establishing the landlord's right to repossess commercial property immediately upon lease termination. Sylvia explained to Donald that under the doctrine of tenancy at sufferance, Aegis Tech Group had lost all legal rights to the premises. They were now considered trespassers under the law. She looked at Donald and asked how he wanted the notice delivered. Donald insisted on having it hand-delivered in person to Julian Brady. Sylvia called a professional process server named Bruce Logan. Bruce was a broad-shouldered man who looked like he could lift a small car, but he had a very polite manner. He had worked as a county deputy for many years and knew how to handle difficult situations without escalating them. Donald explained that the delivery might face resistance from office security or secretary staff, but Bruce just smiled and said he would get the signature. He put on his heavy leather jacket, placed the legal documents into a secure folder, and took the envelope. By 11:30 in the morning, the process server was at the corporate offices. Donald sat in a small coffee shop down the street waiting patiently. At 11:29, his phone buzzed with a message from Bruce. The delivery was complete. Bruce had bypassed the front desk by pretending to be a courier with urgent documents. Julian had signed the receipt himself. Bruce even attached a photo of Julian's face when he opened the envelope. Julian looked confused and pale, staring at the paper as if it were written in a foreign language. Donald stared at the image, feeling the finality of the moment. There was no going back now. The 24-hour clock had started, and Aegis Tech Group had until 11:29 the next morning to pack up their entire digital operation and leave his property. He took a sip of his espresso and began planning the next phase of his response. He knew the corporate legal team would soon realize their mistake, but it was already too late. The eviction notice was legally binding and the countdown had begun. He sat back in the coffee shop, watching the people walk by, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The company had treated him as if he were nothing, but now they would have to answer to him. He knew the next 24 hours would be chaotic, but he was completely prepared for the storm. By noon, Donald had completed his exit. He opened his personal phone, went to the settings, and logged out of every corporate account, email client, and chat application. He blocked Julian Brady's phone number, as well as the numbers for the Human Resources Director, Stella Ward, and the office assistant. He did not want to hear their excuses or their hollow apologies. He walked to a quiet neighborhood bar named Holloway's. The place was nearly empty, filled with the scent of old wood and the sound of low jazz music. Donald sat on a leather stool and ordered a cold martini with 2 olives. The bartender, an older man named Oliver, gave him a quiet nod and went to work. Donald looked at his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. He looked calm, like a man who had completed a satisfying day of work, rather than a man who had just initiated the shutdown of a multi-million-dollar tech firm. He thought back to the countless weekends and holidays he had spent working at his desk, sacrificing his personal life for a company that ended his career with an automated email. The regret was gone, replaced by a clean sense of detachment. He knew he had made the right decision, and that his dignity was worth far more than their empty corporate promises. His personal phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text message from Toby Miller, a junior IT specialist at Aegis Tech Group. Toby was a young man whom Donald had mentored, and since Donald had not blocked Toby's personal number, the message came through. Toby asked if Donald was really evicting the company from the data center. Donald did not reply immediately, watching the green olives slide in his glass. Toby sent another message, stating that Julian had read the eviction notice to the staff, calling it a desperate joke by a bitter former employee. Julian had laughed and told the Human Resources Department to call Donald and tell him he could keep his office stapler. Donald felt a flash of cold amusement. Julian was still trying to act tough, unable to comprehend the scale of his mistake. 10 minutes later, Toby sent another message. He wrote that the company chief legal counsel had just arrived at the office looking terrified. The lawyers had pulled Julian into a private conference room and pulled down the blinds. Toby wrote that Julian was no longer laughing and looked white as a sheet. Donald took a slow sip of his martini. The corporate executives were finally realizing the truth. They had checked the accounting ledger and found the 5 months of unpaid rent. They had realized the LLC was registered to Donald and that their entire server infrastructure was located inside his building. Toby sent another text, explaining that the company had no off-site backup system because Julian had cut the budget for recovery servers, claiming they were moving to the cloud. However, the cloud transition was only 10% complete, meaning 90% of their operations were still running on the physical hardware inside Donald's data center. Toby wrote that Julian had tried to call the data center facility directly, but the administrative staff refused to speak with him, stating they could only communicate with the registered owner, VTS Bookkeeping and Logistics LLC. The phone buzzed again with a call from an unknown number. Donald declined it. Then a voicemail notification appeared. It was from the Chief Executive Officer, Walter Higgins. Donald played the message. Walter's voice was shaking, trying to maintain a professional tone. He said there had been a terrible misunderstanding. and that he was unaware of Julian's actions. He begged Donald to call him back so they could reach a sensible agreement and avoid any interruption to their services. He offered to double Donald's salary, give him a massive promotion, and pay all outstanding lease debts immediately. Donald deleted the message without responding. He was not interested in negotiations or apologies. They had called him redundant, and now they were learning what happened when the redundant pieces stopped working. He ordered another drink and waited. He received more texts from Toby, describing the growing panic in the office. People were running back and forth, and the legal team was frantically trying to contact any local judge to get an emergency stay. However, since the courthouse was closed for the day, they could not file anything until the following week. The company was trapped, and they knew it. Donald felt a sense of peace. He had spent years working late nights and weekends for people who did not respect him, and now he was the one in control. He watched the rain begin to fall outside the bar window, feeling completely warm and secure inside the booth. He knew that their major clients, including several large retail networks and logistics firms, would soon be unable to access their systems, resulting in millions of dollars in losses. The hours were ticking away, and he knew that by tomorrow morning, the entire corporate empire would go silent. The night passed, and Tuesday morning arrived with gray clouds and a cool breeze. Donald sat in the same corner booth at Holloway's, holding a cup of cold black coffee. The deadline was approaching. At 11:25, Donald arrived at the data center building at Richmond Parkway. He had hired a private security firm, paying $4,500 for 2 retired officers to accompany him. He had also arranged for a professional locksmith to be present. The 2 security guards stood at the entrance of Unit 3B, their faces expressionless. The locksmith stood ready with his tools. The data center inside was humming with the sound of cooling fans and server racks. A few junior technicians were working inside, looking nervous. Donald entered the building and announced that the lease was officially terminated due to non-payment and lack of renewal. He informed the technicians that they had 4 minutes to pack their personal belongings and exit the premises, as the building was being secured. The technicians did not argue. They had already heard about the panic at the main office. They grabbed their laptops and left the building quickly. A young technician named Eric asked Donald if they could copy their local server configurations first, but Donald calmly replied that they should have thought about backups before declaring his role redundant. At 11:29, the locksmith began working on the outer doors, replacing the electronic keypads and physical deadbolts with entirely new systems. He worked with professional speed, the sound of his drill echoing down the concrete corridor. He handed a fresh set of brass keys to Donald. The security guards took their positions at the gates, ready to turn away anyone from Aegis Tech Group. At 11:32, Donald's phone buzzed with a short text message from Toby Miller. The message consisted of a single word: dark. The data center had gone offline. Donald walked to the main power breakers and the network switches. He stood in the cold corridor of the server room, looking at the long rows of flashing green and blue lights. The air was cold, and the sound of the cooling system was a constant roar. Donald reached out and flipped the physical power controls one by one. The humming of the servers died down to a silent whisper. The green lights on the equipment racks turned to dark gray. The cooling fans slowly stopped spinning, and the room became completely silent and dark. Across the city, Aegis Tech Group lost access to every client website, every database, and every internal application. Their portals went blank, showing only error messages. Julian Brady, the strategic director who thought he could run a tech company with spreadsheets and condescension, was locked out of his own systems. The CEO, Walter Higgins, was left with a useless corporate network and hundreds of angry clients demanding answers. Donald walked out of the building into the cool morning air. He watched the locksmith finish, securing the final door and placing a large notice of eviction on the front gate. He felt a deep, clean sense of relief. He had spent 18 years serving a company that threw him out like garbage, but he had walked away with the keys to their survival. He got back into his sedan and drove away, leaving the silent building behind. He dialed Gideon's number and told him the building was secured and Gideon congratulated him on a flawless execution. The spreadsheet sultan had been logged out permanently, and Donald Vance was finally free. He had shown them that the most quiet workers are often the ones holding the entire structure together. He knew they would try to sue him or offer him millions to lease the space again, but he did not care. He had made his point, and the damage was done. They would have to build their business from scratch, and they would never forget the name of the man they had dismissed as redundant. As he drove home, the sun broke through the clouds, and Donald smiled. It was a warm, genuine smile. He had reclaimed his life, and the future was entirely his own. He had spent his career maintaining their systems, but now he was looking forward to building something for himself. The silence of the phone was the most beautiful sound he had heard in years. Aegis Tech Group had tried to erase him, but in doing so, they had erased themselves. They had ignored the foundation of their business, and the collapse was entirely of their own making. He was no longer a small piece of their machine. He was the architect of his own destiny. He knew that his future was wide open, and he was excited to explore new paths. For the first time in 18 years, he felt a deep, genuine happiness that had nothing to do with corporate deadlines, physical servers, or administrative checklists.